topic that they're having problems with. Cassie?
Well, it was good. Yeah, I feel like most of the stuff that I had, you guys went over, but what I noticed was you guys asked a lot more questions of the students, and you asked a lot more questions to more students than you did last time, which I really liked. You had an operational definition, which was nice. I have some like quotes in here, but I think you guys can read those on your own. That's pretty much it.
I noticed in the video too, I purposely ignored Hillary in one of the
Yeah,
questions
I wrote
that I
that
answered,
in my-
and I like laughed the second time I saw it, because I was like, I just called on a non-volunteer, go me.
Yeah, I wrote on here, asked for student explanation, but called on May Ann even though she didn't raise her hand. Hillary raised her hand very enthusiastically.
You were visibly upset. So I'm sorry, I'll call it next time.
You'll get another chance. Be sure and have the answers to your questions on your slides, which they do. Let me see here. Discussed. Oh, when we're talking about, we had a discussion about definitions. Why is it important for students to learn eventually, after they understand the concept, the formal definition?
It's really to use that jargon in the community. So establish the definition, that means we're all talking about the same thing in the same manner. My red versus your red.
Yeah, so if I call this red and she calls that red, we're not talking about the same thing. You have to have the same definitions, and I think too often teachers and students think memorizing definitions is for a test. Well, yes, you do that, but the reason I think students need to understand why the nomenclature in every profession is important. I've got a daughter-in-law in art, and she talks art language that I don't understand, and I have to get her to, to explain it to me. What does she mean, by genres? Well, I know what that is, but, other things that are in art. So I think I don't know how you can do it. Y'all are clever. Think about how you might be able to have some kind of activity, lesson, whatever you want to call it, about the importance of academic vocabulary.
And then can't they read an article, like a real life article, and where it has the academic vocabulary, or they can even write a script or pretend, what is that thing? Where if they're pretending to be a scientist, they have to know how to use scientific words, whereas whenever they're pretending to be a historian, they're using that type of vocabulary instead, so they can take on active roles.
Is that we did theater? You're talking about?
I don't know, I just remember reading that somewhere.
I know what you're talking about.
Right?
Yeah. You could do something that's like, for instance, like there are multiple different types of succulents, and so if you just say, oh, a cactus, you have like 4 different cacti out, and you're like, okay, go grab the cactus, and they like don't know, which one, and so then that can transition to, okay, this is why we have specific like scientific names for each type, so that way, throughout the world, whenever you talk about this specific cactus, everybody knows you're referring to this one, not that one.
Right, but that has to do with genus species names, and there's more to it than that. So that would be an important part of it.
Well, and I think too, this would go back into playing into etymology, when we're talking about root words and scientific words, and I think that's one of those things that you would incorporate into when you're teaching students scientific words and root words, prefix, suffix, because it would only help them understand definitions later.
Oh, absolutely. We know it's true in science. I don't know about how many other areas, but we know it's true in science. I kind of like Hillary's idea or play on it, in which you might take, I'd say maybe a paragraph, not too long, of course I'm thinking of science, so you could go to a science journal and take even an abstract of some scientific report of something that you could translate into language that they would understand. But why it's acceptable in a scientific journal to have it written exactly this way, because the people who are in that field know exactly what that says. Anyway, I don't know, think about it. I think that's something that probably should be done at the beginning of school in some way. Think if there's some really clever, interesting to kids that you could do something with of academic vocabulary. Oh, and then also think about, because I don't remember who said this, but think about your language, because it's easy for us to, when we're talking, we're not thinking about the words that are coming out of our mouth. That moment, we're thinking about the words that are coming next. So sometimes things come out of our mouths that are not exactly the way we want them to. For example, I heard in the lesson that chemical properties are evidence of a chemical reaction. I'm thinking, really? How is that? So it sounded to me like science words, but they didn't really go together. So, if we're gonna say something like that and it's confusing to me, think about what it would be to what these
I
are,
think you
11-year-olds.
misheard me. I
Huh?
remember saying it.
Okay.
But the man asked, oh, what's a chemical property? And then I was saying, remember when we explored chemical reactions, we talked about chemical properties. So that's where I was making that connection to kind of.
Well, I think the language said chemical properties are evidence of a chemical reaction. So, you have to practice the sentence structures and all that you're going to use. And then on this slide right here, you can see it when you get back to it, the definition of a pure substance. So it says sample of matter with constant composition. Now, I don't think 11-year-olds are going to know what constant composition is, so I translated it to what you'd done in your Explore of different colors or the same colors as you saw with the Legos. So, and then they would come back with some kind of general idea of what constant composition means. All the same stuff together or whatever. And then the same thing on this one that says the definition of an element. Listen to it. An element is a pure substance that is composed of the same type of matter throughout. What does that mean, same type of matter throughout, to an 11-year-old? I don't think they're going to understand that. Could a visual be used with that? I'm thinking it could. So think about how you can't just take a definition off of somewhere, which is an adult level, and give it to an 11-year-old and thinking that they're going to understand that, or even a 14-year-old who speaks perfect English. So think about how you can make it more visible with them. And then we got into the discussion about iron, and it was said something about you have iron in your body. And it reminded me of a story that I told Team 1 about my granddaughter. She was about 8 years old, one of my granddaughters. And she, my mother had taken her to the dentist and she had a cavity again. And she came home and I said, well, honey, what did the dentist say? And she said, I have another cavity. I said, oh no, Brittany. I said, it's really important to take good care of your teeth because cavities run in your genes, or in your genes. And she said, it's running in my genes? So, sometimes we use language that we know what we're talking about, but other people don't. So think about it whenever you're teaching kids. So when we say there's iron in our body, what are they envisioning? It's not what we envision. And then I was telling them also that I was curious about the use of an iron that you use to press clothes with and an ironing board, that it did not mean that the irons are made of iron back in those days. They were made of cast iron, which there are different kinds of cast iron, different elements or compounds in there that are made up. So you know how you get lost on the web. Well, I got lost into this other website called, what was it? Old Things, the history of old things, or something like that. It was really interesting, but it went back into the history of ironing or pressing clothes. And so maybe back, don't quote me, maybe the 1800s, the poor women who were hired to do that were called manglers. And so they didn't iron the clothes, they mangled the clothes, which has a different meaning today. And then if you look back into the 1600s and the 1400s in other cultures like Chinese and all, they took the wrinkles out of fabric in a lot of different ways, not with the kind of irons that we're thinking about now. But anyway, it's an interesting history. And then I also found this article out of the journal Science called Setting the Table, that I got for y'all to look at, and then we need to put it in the packet. So, okay, and it's a nice history of the periodic table and how it came to be, and how the different people that were involved in it, etc. But it's a nice history of the periodic table that I think if you're teaching the 8th grade, you probably should, tell the story about it. It didn't just suddenly appear. Somebody suddenly had all of that knowledge and they knew all of that, and they just put it down at this table in, hour and a half. Yes.
Speaking of story, what's the girl's name whose bosses won the Nobel Prize for discovering Jeanette? I think it was Jeans.
The helix, the double helix.
Yeah.
Rosalind Franklin?
Yeah, that's her name. That's what it reminded me of when you started talking about a story.
Yeah, stories are important. I mean, it gives a context to students that makes them understand that it's really it's a human effort, and it's not because it involves a lot of work, and it doesn't just suddenly come to people. They have to work to learn, to learn these things. So anyway, so that was another point that I was thinking about. Y'all can sit down. You don't have to stand up. And then on this next slide, where it has concept mapped for the evaluation, it seemed to me that the terms that they're going to be used should be up front and review the terms, and then tell them they need to create a concept map and whatever else y'all had to do. So just another way of thinking. I mean, I'm not saying you have to do it or anything. I'm just suggesting that you think about that. Let's see, is there anything else here that we talked about? Oh, and look for these things on your own lesson plan. So when they listed the materials, they've got, I want it separated into what the teacher uses versus what each student needs versus what each group of students need. So in this case, they put per student, they put X or times students, so times the number of students. I think it might be, if you're talking about other people using it, it might be per student, might be more direct. And then on the group of students, what is it that each group needs? So it doesn't make any difference how many students that you have or how many groups, because you're doing it per student or per groups. And then it's, if you do it for a total of 24 and you've got 30, then you've got to do this extrapolation and so on. So if you would put that on there. And also, all right, so you've got that. I was thinking about where those definitions came from, but you would already have those. Okay, I think that was all that we had. Oh, we need your score sheet.